How do you see how do you see education changing as a consequence of this technology?
You need to have a lot of skills beyond education, as I mentioned before. As jack of all trades, but master of none, right?
I'm going to start with something simple, and just wanted to ask, what do you feel like you generally do at Qualcomm?
So at Qualcomm, I lead the AI product team, and as part of my current position, I should say I have the opportunity and privilege to think blue sky, and working with some fantastic colleagues of mine, translate that blue sky into reality. And every day is a different story. You look at how do you productize some things. There are going to be new challenges. How do you overcome them? These days, it's all about generative AI, and how can you enable generative AI on the edge? And it's not been an easy task, but it's been a fantastic experience going through that journey.
What was blue sky, in your opinion, before sort of this new way? What was innovation before this technology?
So historically, when you look at it, AI kind of comes up in several waves. Historically, it was very simple tasks, which was very vision-oriented, identifying or detecting certain things or classifying certain things in a pictorial representation. Next, the question becomes is, how can I induce common sense into AI so it becomes more predictable based off a certain context, and based on the context is able to provide you certain recommendations. I think that the second portion of it has evolved with time, and I think generative AI is kind of induced or put in that certain flavor wherein you can get contextual based information, and you're able to get that information that matches the emotional intelligence of the user. I think that's the most important aspect, is how do you stay connected with the user, right? And I think as AI is evolving, I think the second portion of contextual personalization becomes even more challenging. I think that's where I think the market is trending towards. I think that's where I'm trying to put a lot more focus and attention towards achieving.
Right. Contextual personalization. I think that's a powerful that's a powerful thing to say. And I suppose to what degree of granularity is that feasibly possible? And also, how much data would you need to make that true? The most personal thing is in your own head, for example. So, how feasible is it that from the distance of acquaintance to mind reader, where do you think AI has the ability to hit?
I think you always start with something small, and then obviously organically grow with time. It's never going to be perfect the first time. So when you look at contextual personalization, the intention here is, can you look and collect information about the user that could be age, preferences, behavioral trends, what kind of language, what kind of words, from a composition standpoint is very private to the user. But the anticipation is, when you collect information about the user, is resident within the device. Our intention is, at no point of time is this information shared to an external server or a cloud kind of stuff. As you start collecting this information, you try to understand, what the user likes, what the user does not like. And, this kind of starts off with some kind of supervised learning, wherein the user kind of indicates his or her preferences. And with time, you go from supervised to semi-supervised and completely unsupervised. Can we get to a point wherein unsupervised is completely doable, wherein applications can trend to behave or map to the user? I think it will happen, but it's going to be, it'll be an evolution with time. Now, my expectation is, as the user uses the app or the application tends to get more data about the user, you hit a certain point of saturation, and then you kind of hit, I would say, the golden jackpot of contextual personalization being completely accomplished. But is it going to be a 6-month effort or a 12-month effort? An 18-month effort is completely out there, because you have a lot of research teams, a lot of engineering folks, a lot of architecture and software guys actually working on it. So I anticipate it's going to be sooner than later, and let's see how the market trends towards that.
When it comes to personalization, I guess continuing on this idea of personalization, if we're having the context of the person sit on mobile devices, that's going to be a data limit for that piece of work. So how feasible is it for it to be that local?
So I think, the way to look at it is there are plenty of edge-based devices. The edge devices just does not have to be just smartphones. It could be, your personal laptops, could be even your IoT devices or sensors, any kind of registered, I would say, device for a user. And these devices can cross-communicate, which means the information available from, let's say, a smartwatch or information collected through a PC, they can stay interconnected, wherein, maybe one device can be used to collect the intrinsics of the user related to health. The information from a PC is mostly related to intrinsics on how a composition of an email or composition of any kind of content is available. The information that's available from a smartphone is more about, the schedule or, what kind of, music does the user kind of usually like to hear. So you happen to have different contexts coming from different devices. And when you happen to have multimodality fusion, you can get them together in one device. In this case, it could be, a laptop because it has high amount of compute resources. And then you use that data and then you modify the algorithms or the model that map onto the applications. And thereby you really try to push in for contextual personalization because that same information about the user is collected from many sources. And then you distribute it to the different sources once that model is personalized.
So you talk about blue sky, I guess blue vision, I guess in your case. How do you define that?
So the thing is, personally for me, you get inspiration from many sources, right? For me, it's about reading science fiction books or looking at Hollywood movies kind of stuff, right? So when you look at it, you look at the possibilities of what is doable. And once you're available that, then you start also looking at a lot of UX studies. The UX studies provide you a lot of context of what kind of problems are you trying to really solve. And then see, based on this particular example or the data that you've collected, you anchor on what the solution space and go for it. Never aim for perfection in the first go, but the intention is to be able to get it executed on the edge-based devices, and with time, aim for perfection.
It's always interesting how art, sort of informs science. It's never exactly how it's sort of perceived, but it seems to always happen somehow. It's very interesting.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. This is something I've learned over the years. You got to keep your eyes and ears open, right? You got to have a lot of social interaction, have some kind of hobbies which are beyond just education, right? And that's how you try to get some of your, inputs.
How do you build a team that enables this sort of innovation and moving sort of this needle forward? How do you encourage people in this direction? How do you motivate them? How do you pick them? How do you do something like this? Because no one can do it by themselves.
So the couple of things, when you're trying to build a strong team, obviously the first important thing is you want to look for the technical acumen. Do they happen to have the necessary experience, the skill set to be successful in a certain role in a job? That's pretty much given. So, you obviously look for it. The second important thing is, I would say personally, is in terms of personality skills. Is the person coming in an avid listener? Is he giving the opportunity, for others to kind of give in their inputs so that, you can kind of respond to it? How strong is the cross-functional skills? Are you able to work with, people of different personalities? Kind of things. And last but not the least is, you need to have a lot of skills beyond education, as I mentioned before. I think, if you happen to have a passion, you have a hobby in sports, you have a passion in reading books or something like that, as you start putting in more time in there, that's how I think, you will start thinking outside the box and start, basing on your exposure and experience and the technical acumen, you can mix up ideas and come forward with that. If you don't happen to have that external passion apart from work, then, you're pretty much being pigeonholed to become a micro-specialist, and it becomes quite difficult to be innovative in that box, right? So at least from my personal experience, I really push for people who look at things outside the box.
What are there areas of interest outside, technology that inform technology better than others? You talked about movies, you talked about books. Are there, how can sports sort of inject itself into the technologist's mindset to inform his or her work?
Yeah, I think it's, if you're into even sports, right, like you watch NFL games or NBA games, you can look at, how people are putting up, let's say, even defensive or offensive schemes, and how they actually trying not to give up and even when they are down, how they're really pushing themselves to aim for perfection. So, when you look for, such kind of, games or personalities who are involved in them and study about it, you understand that, how they approach a certain problem state, right? I think that's the science you want to really go behind and see if it can personally induce you into thinking outside the box.
We talked, so we sort of talked a little bit about all the things surrounding what it is to innovate and how you sort of AI itself to some degree. I'd love to talk about, now that we have this new wave, Gen AI. Gen AI is sort of taken over the consciousness. Obviously, there's been AI technologies before, and there will be after that, but the surface area of Gen AI has been very intriguing for the average population. So not to even talk about, there's this sort of the generative AI for images and sometimes a little bit of video, which isn't very solid right now, but the text version, I think, leveraging the fact that it had the most data to play with has been quite useful for quite a lot of people. So the utility function there is very high. So with the, now that this space has been reasonably well bounded, and so where do you see it going, and how do you see it yourself? Sort of how do you see it moving forward? How do you see its utility? How do you see the future of this particular kind of technology? So
I think a few things, right? When you look at large language models, which have been very textual in nature, as you asked for it, they are foundational in nature, which means they are, jack of all trades but master of none, right? So our expectation is, can you use these foundational models to be very task specific? The task specific here could be, as you mentioned, as utility based, either on productivity related, content related, or even, optimizing your personal element. So which they become very task oriented. So I think moving forward, the most important thing is, how can you make these task-specific functions to be much more accurate and connected to the user? I think that's going to be a significant problem, and how do we really get that done? So that's one portion to it. The second portion to it is, when you look at these large foundational models, are kind of continuing to grow. It started off with a billion parameters. Now we're going to 7 billion, 10 billion, 100 billion kind of parameters. The question really becomes is more about challenges and how do you deploy them on edge-based devices? Because, you can't send every query to the cloud, right? It's going to be extremely expensive. So there's going to be a lot of investment from an edge-based infrastructure and how do you really accommodate these large language models. The third important element really becomes is, moving forward, are you going to look at multimodality fusion? Meaning, it's been always a text-based input, but can I have a voice-based input? Can I mix that with a camera-based input? So that you can have a multimodality fusion to be in a position to define your prompt in such a way that it's meaningful even before it goes into the large language model. So it means you can have a lot more science around the prompt engineering itself. And these days it's, a lot of focus and attention on it, because there's been talk about, infusing that with the vector databases, infusing that with, retrieval augmentation, so that, you can define or fine-tune the prompt itself before it goes to the large models. So I think it's a science of its own. So I think, moving forward, as you asked before, is it'd be more focus on personalization, more focus on accommodating these large models on the edge, and how do you optimize the input prompts to make it much more meaningful for the large models. I'm pretty sure there's plenty more things that kind of come along, but the next 12, 18 months, I think that you can see a lot of industry focus on these big three areas.
What have you seen in terms of the vector databases that's been interesting? What a lot of people don't know is vector databases have been around for a long time, or a reasonable amount of time, at least since the mid-90s. So how do you see its, the resurgence in the public consciousness? How do you see it affecting generative AI in general?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So the vector databases, by definition, as I mentioned, has been there for quite some time, but it's been on the cloud, wherein you happen to have databases which are mapped to very specific functions. The question really becomes is, can you generalize it, or do you want to specialize it for a specific task? And you want to specialize for a specific task, can I actually bring it to the edge, or does it have to be resident of the cloud? So I think, there's still a lot more, I would say, activity in initial stages of integrating that so that your physical semantic search is much more meaningful and filtered to define your prompt before it goes to large models. So I think we're in the early stages as we speak, but I think with time, this is going to get a little bit more polished, and then we're going to see a lot more integration of the vector databases into meaningful context for the applications. I don't think it's largely deployed commercially as of yet.
So from my experience with vector databases, they can get sections of text, but so context seems to be a fundamental issue with these generative models, right? The amount of context you can superimpose upon it, and also the amount of context it can infer from what you give it, that sort of range is difficult. That balance is difficult with all the other things like power and time, and that people are concerned about when you talk about anything that has to have utility, especially in technology space where the promise is a reduction of effort and time. So, what do you think the directions are for vector databases that what can they improve in themselves to make these sort of features better?
I think this is one of the big research topics, isn't it? How do you really make the vector database a little bit more meaningful? As I mentioned before, the context of the prompt is extremely important for the large models to be much more meaningful and to be much more connected to the user. So these vector databases kind of act as a reference, but these references are based off previous history of what the user may have liked, or which is very manual in nature. It has been constructed very manual in nature because it's data collected at the time, but does not necessarily mean that it supports much better context. So the question really becomes is if your input prompt, these days, if it goes to 4K or 8K, can it support that much amount of characters? Not quite sure, right? And these has to be fine-tuned for an enterprise-based application or a consumer-based application. Enterprise-based application could be anything to do with IT-related questions, anything to do with your health-related questions. Commodity or consumer could be very, general questions about, okay, I need to book my ticket on so-and-so day, can this be arranged? Right? So they're kind of widespread in terms of how the utility is going to be established, but we don't have those vector databases actually fine-tuned for that portion. So my expectation is we have plenty of startups that's kind of coming in that space, and how are they going to look at the data and make analytics of it and make it automated in a way that it kind of helps deployment of large models. I think it's going to be the biggest study moving forward for many enterprise vendors.
So when you talked about IoT, you insinuated a decent amount, and I think it's a very important subject because personalization is something that, at least when it comes to technology, can really scale its impact. You've seen it over and over again with phones and different sort of technologies, watches, everything that sort of can be on the body. And I think people are experimenting now with clothes as well. So there's a relationship between people's space and technology that's very powerful. And IoT devices are the vehicle. So where do you see IoT devices and sort of trying to sort of use AI and use generative AI to sort of improve the lives of people?
So when you look at IoT by itself, right, IoT is a very broad market space. It does plenty of stuff from collecting sensory information about temperature, humidity, kind of stuff, which is very binary in nature. And you want to make certain decisions based on the data collected on controlling, either the temperature, turning off the lights, especially in smart buildings, depending upon, the number of people available. But it also can get complex into systems like retail space, or even in industrial, big machine space. I think in terms of generative AI, I think the concepts are plenty, right? And one of them happens to be, if you look at a retail space especially, the question really becomes is if you happen to have certain commodities, you want to be in a position to sell those commodities, you want to arrange them in such a way that you have the highest amount of traction by a consumer. But it's very difficult to make that prediction based on a certain amount of retail space that you might have. So the question really becomes is using generative AI, can I place my commodities in such a way that it has a lot amount of traction. So it kind of gives you the rearrangements of possibilities on how these different shelves should be racked, those kind of stuff.
Have you worked on it? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So I think this is something that's being looked at. I anticipate the next couple of months you're going to see a lot more, integration opportunities. But I think this is areas where retail is going to really grow up pretty soon.
So retail, you feel generative AI is going to allow retail to stack shelves in the most optimal way for most consumers within the area, and that's something generative AI can do. In what way? So is it, how is that anything more than a numerical assessment, where it's just like probability of interest relative to the area, and then sort of arrange things to suit that purpose?
So there are two ways to read it. One is specifically looking at pictorial representations or diagrams that you can create, where you can say, if this is the amount of square footage that's available, how can I look at placement of certain commodities to get the maximum utilization for the available square footage? So you have a lot of possible scenarios, and those possible scenarios can be created using a textual command, and then you happen to have a lot of pictorial representations being created on an instant basis. So that is one element to it. The second element to it is if you have a consumer that comes in, and if you happen to have a certain app suggesting, I want to, pick up my groceries for A, B, and C, please tell me what needs to happen. The textual command actually gives you an output suggesting you go to aisle A, B, and C, have all the stuff here, and get it completed, and or be in a position to do it for you. All you have to do is to pick up, which is more textual-based analytics from a retail space. The other one, which I mentioned, is more about commercial deployment of commodities based on possibilities to have the highest amount of traction. It's very manual these days, but using generative AI like text-to-image kind of apps, you'll be in a position to actually see that visually.
One concern a lot of people have had, this has been brought up so much in the public sphere, is privacy security with these models. As they integrate deeper into our own spaces, the concern increases. So what's your perspective on that?
I think it's absolutely important, and that's one of the reasons why in my current role, we're putting a lot more emphasis on all the data that's being collected about the user to make it much more personalized, because it's resident within the registered device of the user. None of them is shared to a server or a cloud or any fog-based node, only because user privacy and personalization data is extremely critical. Now, from a security standpoint as well, we do exactly the same thing. Once information is collected, it is completely deleted the moment the information is collected, which means at any point of time it's not resident in storage or some kind of memory that others could access in the wrong way. So that's the intention. Now, moving forward, I totally expect some more changes to kind of come in. There's a lot of regulatory compliance standards that governments are kind of putting in that needs to be respected. So it's most important, how do you translate that vision into reality by looking at these regulations and then integrating that into an application deployment. So
there are a few questions there. So let's talk about the technology in and of itself to a greater degree. The models are very, very compute and data expensive. It seems like the currency of AI is data. Is what it is. That's what's been told. So, and even the hyperparameters are just sort of just a way of tweaking what exists to a granular degree in this vector space in a way it seems like. So, how realistic is it to have something of greater utility closer and closer to the phone? So we've talked to some people at Intel who talked about how they're trying to get chips that are better suited at a more granular level for operations that have to do with linear algebra calculations, and that's been a very interesting conversation, and it's bounded by its own reality as well. But so there are works sort of restructuring the whole stack from silicon up to be better suited for these sorts of things. So that's going to be really exciting to bring all that down. But there is, I would assume that there's going to be a limit on that in principle. So with all that being said, with all these interesting things happening, where do you see the boundaries in your experience when it comes to sort of bringing the technology sort of closer to the individual, where you're dealing with less resources in principle?
I think to a large extent, when you start putting intelligence and investment on the edge, And the investment on the edge is multifold. Right? What can you do on the silicon side? What can you do on the platform side? What can you do on the software side? The combination of all of that makes user experience much more cleaner and so. Now, the expectation is there's always going to be bounds. Based off a form factor, based off a power envelope, based off the energy consumption limit. There's certain things that can be done on the edge, there's certain things that cannot be done on the edge. At that point of time, there's always going to be elements wherein you want to have a dependency on the cloud, what we call as a hybrid environment. You want to make a hybrid environment only and only the edge-based device is just not in a position to satisfy a certain query, right? So that's the reason we kind of take a two-pronged approach, completely, getting most of the information that's available to the user, much more accurate and closer to the user from an edge-based device. And only if that edge-based device does not have the necessary infrastructure, either could be compute or it's just not able to satisfy a certain query, then it resides to the cloud. I think a lot more people are starting to look at the hybrid architectures, but it's going to be a while before it's commercial ready, I would say.
Okay, so for the hybrid architectures, what's the how I want to say how useful is it? And that's probably not the right way to say it, but how does it work right now? What is the experience right now of the hybrid architectures?
So the way to look at it, I would say, is if you happen to have a simple language model, the language model, you ask a certain query. If the query, in this case, for example, you have a large language model that is trained for health-based queries, right? And to answer questions about your insurance, your doctor, what kind of prescription, those kind of stuff, which is very generic health-related questions. But if the user suddenly asks questions which are quite specialty-based, getting into cardiology or what elements around cardiology, the model is not specifically trained to answer those questions. So instead of providing the wrong response, because you have information available, possibly from a vector database that says, this information comes from a specialty domain, then it makes a judgment call to invoke the cloud. At that point of time, the cloud-based model, which is especially trained for this kind of specialties, is in a position to answer that query. So that's how you make a judgment call based on the information that's available from the user. Now, obviously, it can be morphed in different ways, but the expectation is, this is how you set up first and then organically grow with time.
So I know you just gave this as an example, but in my mind, I'm thinking, if you're making a query of that complexity, or I guess, people in general, when they make queries and have questions, there is a delay that they are willing to accept. Whether or not the server can facilitate that delay, we can assume it to some degree that it will be able to if it's a public-facing product. So the utility of the local instance of the language model is the speed it's supposed to provide. If it's just speed that it is supposed to provide, is not as the differential in the experience isn't that high. This is just a guess, but there are lots of examples where you need instantaneous responses that these models, like if it's trying to make decision making about, even if it's somebody's robbing a bank is the most theatrical example, but someone's robbing a bank, you want to make sure that the police is called. The camera calls the police. It's not a retroactive device. It's actually an active device, and you need the language model right there to do that. That's reasonably accurate and doesn't scare customers, but says, okay, there's an incident. Let's capture this information and summarize it in a way that's meaningful for the people who are going to assist. I think there's utility. There's definitely, that's not something you want to send to the server per se, or you want to have that decision as quickly as happening as quickly as possible. And there are lots of situations where people are working, or the safety concerns where this can help with that, right? Talking about in remote locations, you're talking about having experiences that are quite personal, but feeling safe within that context. So that's an interesting angle that I thought was interesting. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's fair. It really depends on the context of the use case, I would really suspect. Right, there are going to be certain situations where in really an instantaneous response, the question really becomes, does the physical device that's available be in a position to provide that instantaneous response? If it is just not available, then you don't have a choice but to rely on the cloud. But that decision is always based on pre-deployment. before you deploy, you always run through the scenarios and then try to understand what problems you're trying to solve, right? And if this happens to be one such issue, you focus on it and try to put necessary infrastructure and the platform resources standpoint to be able to address that question. If it is not, then you always come into the situations where, maybe the next generation addresses it, but for the time being, you have to rely on the cloud. I mean, one such example could be in automotive environment, right? You're driving in, most of the cars these days are kind of coming quite complex with, dashboards which are very heavily display-based. And you want to make instantaneous decisions because it leads to the life or death of, the people inside the car. You can't rely on the cloud because it might take a couple of seconds just to make that decision. So the question really becomes, is the automotive chassis platform definition better have enough compute resources to make the decision on the fly very quickly? If it is not, then you're going to have a certain problem state. So that's how I think, people look at these things.
I think based on what you've said, it might be, and I might be wrong, the trade-off between personalization and personalization of answers and localization. So what do I mean? If you're asking something of a greater specialty to a server-based or cloud-based language model, then that makes a lot of sense because you can have the, like you said, you can have the specialization somewhere different, and that question is about that context. So the context can live on the cloud in that particular example. In an example where you want something more personalized, the personal information lives locally on the device for all kinds of reasons, like security, like we talked about. So then we go back to the same problem where do we have a back to the database that's able to transfer context over to the cloud enough that it has the compute to give you the answer, but needs the context from the local device, and then the cycle starts again. So what do you think about that space and how to solve that problem, and how you've been thinking about that?
I think both of them can coexist, right? Personalization is definitely important, and then depending upon what kind of use case, instantaneous response becomes a little bit more practical, like an automotive environment. The question really becomes is, what are the key performance indicators? What are the key experience indicators? So it's really difficult to give one answer that kind of fits all, but I would say depending upon those two parameters, especially in automotive environment or a retail environment, or even let's say a smartphone environment, the response could be very, very different. Now, our expectation is, at least personally, what we're trying to do is be in a position to support both, and depending upon the form, fit, and function, because there's always going to be restrictions on a certain price point, certain power that's available, that's certain compute capacity that's available. You make certain choices, right? And then with time, make adjustments depending upon how the scenario falls.
Let's talk about the integration. A lot of technology companies have sprung up from this technology, from this technology, not to be redundant. And a lot of it obviously is in the generative content space, because that surface area is zero to creativity, so it's quite well suited. But there are lots of different areas where AI needs to get integrated into because the infrastructure is so robust, and it needs to climb its way into, and sort of like water in the cracks of rocks. So could you talk about how you see that happening, and where you see that happening most quickly and slowly and sort of most easily?
Specifically, we take the generative AI space. Generative AI space started like I think with OpenAI opening up with the DALL-E, right, wherein people had textual inputs, created some fantastic images. Then you had startups like Runway ML showcasing possibilities with video kind of stuff. So I think, with time, I think you've had a lot more traction on a consumer stuff, I would say base, with commodity kind of use cases. What I think the commodity kind of use cases is, people being in a position to morph photographs, people being in a position to morph videos. That's a lot more traction. It sees there's a lot of value and get going.
And it's good for the narcissist.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And in fact, my 70-year-old mother is in love with these generative AI apps because it takes out wrinkles in her face, right? And she starts taking a lot of selfies, and she starts putting it in her social group because it makes her 20 years younger. I am happy because she's happy, right? So anything that gets her connected is fantastic. Then you go into productivity space, right? Productivity space is about, how can you actually make your life easier, especially in the context of sentence correction, tone correction, or, these automatic chatbots that can be much more meaningful. And I think that's also getting a lot more traction, especially with, I would say, enterprise-based chatbots, which are very fine-tuned, like, for a 24-hour, customer help kind of hotlines. Then you're getting into content creation space. Content creation space also, for example, like game environment, wherein, you want to really create a lot of background, but the background is extremely difficult to create, based on the user spec. Historically, it would take 6 to 9 months for many software engineers to actually create that collateral. But now with textual-based information, you could create some fantastic backgrounds. I think, these are some of the areas which are kind of starting to come up. And same thing with video conferencing. Video conferencing, people want to replace the background, but you only have like a triage of 20 or 50 options. But now with the textual or voice-based input, I can change my background to being whatever it might be the case, right? It can be completely wild. So I think these are some of the areas that are kind of starting to come up. I totally expect this will morph to many complex verticals like automotive domain, for example. Automotive domain is one such example could be as I have a very old car, right? Every time it breaks down, it gives me a light of all kind of shapes and blink and all kind of color, right? I have to open up my manual and then see what the heck is this, right? Depending upon the shape, the color, the frequency, it's something. And those manuals are like 300 pages long, right? So I can go make my digital assistant in an automotive environment to ask, hey, can you tell me what is the problem? It knows the context, it has a contextual intelligence, it tells me exactly what needs to happen, and then does the booking for me. That's the next level of evolution, wherein you want to have a personal assistant pretty much in every facet of a home pack. So I think it's going to slowly grow into some of the areas which I mentioned, but I think 2024 is going to be a major area because you're going to see commercial deployment of many such applications and then hopefully scale with time.
How do you see education changing as a consequence of technology?
I think it's going to. It's already seeing a lot more. Mods as we speak. I think specifically post pandemic or during the pandemic time frame, where a lot of education was very virtual in nature. It became quite paramount that there are going to be instances or situations wherein you need to happen to have a very good student-teacher relationship. And our expectation, I would say, is you want the teacher to be in a position to be as involved, even in a virtual environment, with a character, let's say a personalized avatar, like you would see in a class environment. So the question really becomes as if I happen to have a personal computer and, a student has a doubt in the homework. Now, based on the camera that's available on a computer or using a smartphone, they can understand the context. And then you ask a question to a chatbot. The chatbot here has a physical shape and the character of your teacher. And, the teacher is able to speak, depending upon what the issue is. And I think there's going to be, plenty of areas where you can stay connected. Now, these are the good things. Now, obviously, there's also a bad side of it, wherein, a lot more, plenty of homeworks and a lot of essays, everything is getting completed as a function of generative AI, right? It's a kind of thing that we'll have to control. I'm not exactly sure what the right solution for that is, but, there's always going to be pros and cons, right? And we have to kind of manage it accordingly.
Yeah, I think education a lot of the times is a function of effort. And if the effort is reduced, then the education is reduced. But I think, there's also an opportunity for understanding being it's a tough space, and understanding being the power of the human in general, but even that, it's going to get eaten up a little bit. But productivity will go up, but there might be an atrophy in some angle. But we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
So I'd love you to talk about, and then we've talked about everything else but Qualcomm. So I'd love you to talk about some of the things that you're doing, some of the things that you're inventing, and I think everybody wants to swim in a blue ocean. So I'd love to see what's going on.
I think at Qualcomm, we're putting a lot more emphasis on generative AI and be in a position to connect generative AI applications to a common man, right? Last week or so, we launched a couple of interesting products wherein we talked about where we have a voice-based assistant and showcasing elements of integration with enterprise apps. As an example, if you want to really book a flight on a certain day, all you have to do is you talk to an edge-based device, could be a smartphone, could be a PC, saying I need to book a day trip to Seattle on 28th, on so-and-so time frame. It looks at the schedule, it has its connections to Expedia or Southwest.com or whatever their website is, and then makes that reservation. It has details about your bank, and it does everything, and then sends you a ticket. So everything is booked, you're ready to go, right? So which means you're making a complete, I would say, the next generation intelligent assistant that's able to get that connected, as an example. We also look at simple things like how can I change wallpapers on a smartphone, right? You can have a command suggesting I like to change my wallpaper to be something completely different, again based off a voice command. So that's what I think, we're trying to look at commodity-based use cases, enterprise-based use cases, and then we're trying to see how best we can enable them into various form factors. And they're not quite easy to implement, right? You have hardware challenges. For example, Llama happens to be the most popular LLM model. It's a 7 billion model. To store that model takes about 13 gig of memory in floating point 16. You don't get 13 gig of memory in every device, right? It's going to be quite limited. So the question really becomes is how do you work with compressing that model in a way that it fits a certain form fit function and getting the best utilization out of it. Same thing is when you look at Llama as such, it's very English oriented. You want to be supporting people of different languages and skill set. You want to be having a voice front end or a textual input front end which can support it. Then you have to look at other models which are also qualified, as an example. You go into commercial deployment, then you get into regulatory compliance. The regulatory compliance challenge is going to be, if I deploy this model in Asia, are you looking at some of the geopolitical tensions? So which means the query that you put in does not give you, what you call an output which does not provide a wrong set of information. The wrong set of information is very subjective, but it's quite important that it meets the regulatory compliance standards of a certain nation. So all these things are quite difficult. So one thing is talking about a use case, but the next question is how do you translate that use case in implementation on a platform? And that takes a lot of time. So I think, these days they're putting a lot more attention to detail to make sure that user experiences are not compromised. And hopefully with time, we launch, plenty more things.
Vinesh, thank you very much for coming on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Chris.